You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Shail Khiyara, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi, Shail, and welcome to The Only Constant. I've been looking forward to this episode for months, and we actually had a little issue at some point where I had you booked in my calendar but never sent you the invite, and we had to postpone, and everything got a little messed up. So I'm just really, really happy that we're finally here and we're finally doing this episode. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think AI will solve all the technical mess ups that we have in our busy lives. I'll say I am so glad to be here, and I'm really appreciative of the work you're doing for the last 6, 7 months now. This is the 15th episode, and you have a very thoughtful approach on how you pull these things together. So glad to be here.
Definitely, and I think we'll go even more thoughtful today. At least I would like to open with a question that I really find personally intriguing because it's almost a year ago you wrote this, but still think it's relevant. But you wrote an article that was called "A Moment in Time with AI: Pavlov's dog meets Schrödinger's cat," and already there you have me hooked on using some really nice metaphors from both philosophy and physics and everything. I love that. But could you elaborate about what do you mean by that?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for reading it, Lasse, and I'm glad that you liked it. In this piece, I point out that the adoption of AI seems to have reached a stable phase in the market, um, but organizations that have evolved into entities focused on continuous learning and are incrementally integrating more and more AI solutions, making more strategic investments. They're witnessing consistent advancement in their competitive advantage and in their growth. They're also developing strategies for getting the greatest value from AI, but navigating this landscape is challenging. I argue in this article that um, AI embodies a moral obligation as AI becomes more intertwined, I would say, with our daily lives. It's imperative for us to look at ethical guidelines in the advancement of AI. And I propose that we may find ourselves at a turning point where the incremental cost of artificial intelligence becomes negligible while the investment in these technologies continues to surge. And we're already seeing that sort of commoditization of the incremental cost of intelligence. And this convergence is pretty significant moment, I feel, in societal evolution. So the question I think we're on the brink of, which is akin to Pavlov's dog meets Schrodinger's cat, is where our dependence on AI models becomes more of a reflex.
Mm.
I'll talk more about this in our discussion today, but it becomes more of a reflex, like Pavlov's dog. Yet the outcomes of AI um, and this reliance remains an uncertainty until it's thoroughly vetted, and that's the Schrodinger cat example. So I thought it was a very compelling title. I got a lot of comments, very positive comments on that, and it's a different way, obviously, of thinking of combining these two philosophies into one and applying it to AI.
What do you think? What do you mean by the Pavlov's dog thing? How do you just explain that again, also to listeners who don't know it?
So Pavlov's dog is an experiment of providing an incentive and noticing the reflexes that come through based on that incentive. In this particular
Mm.
test, the
And in
dog
AI, that means
salivates
that
when
it's
an incentive
we are
is
being
provided
compelled
to
just to use it all the
it.
time and then get something back, and we might not see what it's going to do for with us, basically.
Exactly. And I think in similar ways, AI models become a reflex. For example, take a self-driving car, right? Um, if it is able to drive itself, we have an interesting transient trust that is deployed. And you think, okay, the car will drive itself. I can text while I'm in a car, even though
Mm.
that's not legal. And I would not suggest anyone do that. But that's sort of the transient reflex, the transient trust that we get with AI. And that's what I meant to imply with Pavlov's dog example.
Yeah, but it also makes me think about some of the things that I've been speaking a lot about lately. Is that one of the biggest fears I have, or is that we automation bias, right? That we get presented some things. Like if I ask a chat about what are the five key things that what are the key things I should look at in this text, and then it gives me three, for instance. And if
Mhm.
I'd read it myself, I would have found four or maybe two. But I'm like, oh, those three sound reasonable, and then I'm like, okay, I'm accepting it. And then I come dependent on it to suggest me things, but I actually don't know if what it suggests me is what I would have suggested myself, right? So there's this, and how do we even control for that if we're, being automation biased all the time because we're getting presented something that's easier, and then we just adhere to that, and you know, there's no controlling on that.
No, you're absolutely right. So let's talk a little bit about that because I think that's important. There are, interestingly enough, transient truths and absolute truths with AI, and I think this element is continuing to grow in the market. Um, you know, we there's a lot of talk about uh, addressing emotions with AI, right? So if we go in that direction, we see that there are questions around, hey, should we build emotions into AI to make it align to us and become more ethical? It's a frightening thought. If you're familiar with, I'm going to name some names. If you're familiar with R2D2 from Star Wars, if you're familiar with HAL, I assume you are, from 2001 Odyssey, a very interesting space film. If you're
Mhm.
familiar with TARS, which is a robot in one of the best and my favorite Christopher Nolan movies, Interstellar. Um, TARS has a shiny rectangular
Yeah.
monolith, vitty, funny at times, but super helpful. I think emotions don't have to be expressions alone, and what makes a great story is data plus emotions, right? So the emotions in AI raises a question about the authenticity of emotions and whether AI can truly experience them or merely mimic human emotional responses, right? Also, there is this risk of anthropomorphizing AI leads to an overestimation of capabilities. So I think coming to this, there's a true phenomenon occurring in the market when we move from transient trust, your example of trusting what is coming through an LLM or ChatGPT,
Mhm.
to absolute trust. And this progression from transient to absolute in AI reflects a growing comfort with technology.
Mm.
I'll give you an example. I drive an electric car. It
Me too.
navigates on its own,
Mhm.
but it requires a slight rotation of the wheel occasionally to ensure that there's a human hand that is steering it, right? But guess what? A small, soft Valencia orange can be put in the crevice of the steering wheel. And as
How
it
did you find
turns,
how did you find out, Shail? How did you find out?
I read through a lot of blogs. I read a lot, and I tried it out as an experiment. And I would not suggest anyone do this. And as the wheel turns, because of the AI algorithms and the road movements, the the squeeze on the orange mimics human fingers. So the car feels that, okay, you're touching
Mm.
the wheel. Now, do I do that? No. Did I test it? Yes. I do not recommend anyone doing this, but this is how one can trick a sophisticated AI system, much to one's disadvantage, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I don't trust a self-steering car completely, hands-free, as much as I don't trust the first response I get from ChatGPT or Claude, or sometimes the second or the third.
Only
And
trust Gemini.
or Gemini, right from the get go. uh, this is what I mean by transient trust. It's cautious, it's conditional, it's it's based on specific interactions and emotions. And I think as AI systems increasingly demonstrate reliability and sensitivity to human emotions, users may develop a sense of absolute trust, believing
Yeah,
these
yeah,
systems to be infallible.
but that's interesting because it also it leads to another point, right? You read the Air Canada case where they had
Mhm.
their chatbot gave people a discount after they'd taken the trip, right? And that
Right.
was not in the policy. And also the case was that Air Canada said that, well, the chatbot is its own legal entity and is responsible for its own actions. To which the court sort of laughed, like, so you're suggesting that a system you own is liable? No.
Yeah.
That's they almost wrote, "That's a new one," right? And,
Right.
but that just made me think, right? These bots don't have the same, rights as we have as humans, as agents or, whatever we are. Um, and I think a lot of people are saying, looking at robots, no, at humans through the lens of robots, saying that, "Oh, but we are just like the the
Mhm.
robots or the AI engines. We're just like AI." Elon Musk is doing that all the time for some weird reason. But I think you should look at it the other way and say, what does the looking at the AI from the lens of humans, saying, what doesn't the AI have? And I've said this in my earlier podcast episodes as well, that we
Mhm.
have a liberal rights tradition. We have human rights, which is essentially that you're allowed to fail without getting killed. But
Mhm.
robot systems do not have that.
Yeah,
They're not
absolutely right.
allowed to fail.
You're
And I
absolutely right.
think, yeah, and I think that's what it boils down to, at some extent. The absolute trust is the problem is, if people get it inherently, because I don't think legally it will ever happen, and that's where you're gonna have a breaking point. You know, when me trusting it, but me ultimately be liable for what it does. That is a problem we need to solve at some point.
I think that's a problem we need to solve now, and I think absolute trust in AI, when it's based on
Mm,
perceived emotional intelligence of the system, right? Oh, it's very human-like, requires a very rigorous ethical framework and transparency to ensure that this
mm,
trust is well placed and that systems remain accountable.
yeah, yeah. But Shale, um, you wrote this article a year ago, and I think you're a very, very busy man. So how do you even find the time to run both the vocal, voice of the customer in the automation landscape, if I'm not incorrect, and write a book and speak at events, and now you're also a founder and CEO of a new company. How do you find time for doing all this? I think that's also an interesting question.
I wish I could say I've cloned myself, but that is not true. But look, I'm a student of markets. I enjoy learning new things, and I feel that learning is a constant. Since we're talking about the only constant, learning is one of the constants in life. I am good at a lot of things, Lasse, but I am really, really horrible at not doing anything.
And now you're on my podcast as well.
And now
What
I'm
is
on your
what is
podcast.
but what is Pluto Shift, by the way? What is your ambition in the market? Are you just going to be using ChatGPT? I don't think so.
No, look, I think there's vast amounts of inefficiency that exists in industrial markets today, particularly large industrial manufacturing organizations that have deployed immense amount of sensors since sensor technology has significantly commoditized, but they're unable to do anything with that data. And a lot of these systems are archaic. When you look at SCADA, PLC, these are circuits and controllers, process controllers that exist in this market. They're very old and don't have a way to manage interdependencies between multiple data points. This is where AI comes in, and using anomaly detection, machine learning, constraint-driven algorithms. There's a huge opportunity to drive significant efficiency around resource usage in these organizations. Water, chemicals, gas, as an example. I don't know if you're aware, but a single bottle of beer takes 15 bottles of fresh water to make, right?
Mm,
There's an enormous amount of water that is being used in multiple products that are being developed. A lot of the industrial wastewater is not even being treated. Again, the data exists, but to be able to correlate this data and figure out what are the next steps to drive efficiency, reduce costs, is a challenge in this market. It's a pretty significant size market, the industrial manufacturing space. So, with having been in this space in the past many years ago, I by background I'm a civil structural engineer that transitioned into marketing and then running tech businesses over the last 20 years. I wanted to come back to this market now with automation and AI under my belt to be able to transform that industry. That's what we're
Mm.
doing at ProtoShift.
That's really nice because there's a lot of disparate, as you said, a lot of data, disparate data. I know, there's a lot of bigger AI firms that are focusing on areas where you have more structured, not structured data. You might also have different data sources, but it is like a very large volume of this is the data everyone's used, like industry solutions, right? But what you're
Yeah.
looking at is finding something that's actually tailored to individual businesses, right? If I'm understanding you correctly, based on the data they're collecting. So some sort of decision intelligence on top of everything they're doing.
Yes, decision intelligence customized to their particular uh, industrial resource, right? So it could be water, it could be energy, it could be chemical, it could be gas, etc.
That's really great, and I think what you're doing with Pluto Shift AI is going to be really interesting to follow. And I wish you all the best of luck with it now that you've established it.
Thank you.
But you also mentioned some of your background, right, just before, and I know your background is also in the RPA space, where you've been at most of the big RPA companies. So. Uh, I typically say that generative AI is really lucky that we've had these automation waves the last 15 years, because those frameworks we've built for that, and the operations frameworks we've built for it as well, are very neatly suited to incorporate generative AI or AI in general as an integration layer or something like that. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say that, considering generative AI as just an instrument in the automation orchestration may significantly underestimate its transformative impact. I think
Yeah.
generative AI is it's not just another tool within a suite of solutions. In my opinion, it's a foundational shift that redefines the very nature of automation. And let's say, unlike traditional instruments that play predefined notes, I think generative AI composes new symphonies. Creates paths to new solutions that we hadn't imagined. Its ability to generate
Mm.
content, solve complex problems, learn from interactions, positions it more as a conductor and or as you mentioned, orchestrator,
Mm.
more than a mere participant. I think it transcends the role of just an instrument. It has the potential to orchestrate the future of automation itself, and we're starting to see that. Right, we're starting to see ChatGPT through OpenAI move in that direction, move closer to automation.
Yeah, that's at least that's the ambition, and that's what we're trying to see that they're building. I still need. I'm always, Shale, very focused on. I think I realized that the last week or so, actually, only that I always post falsifiable predictions or questions. So I don't like to say that we're going to have an autonomous world because, or we have that, or it's coming. Because if I can't falsify it right now, people will say, "Oh, it is there. It is coming. It is still coming." Right? I don't like that. I like to say we have this now, and then you can say, "No, we don't." Okay, that's why I also sometimes say things that are proven wrong
Yeah.
because that's what you do when you try to figure out things by not just believing in unbelievable hype. So, but what I meant was not necessarily that it's just a piece in the tool like an API call or something. I meant that it's the proximate objectives right now for a lot of companies is to work with it through these or automation frameworks they already have, because it's difficult to actually envision how will operations look on a tool we've had for 1.5 years. I'm a firm believer in the paradigm shift of working with, for instance, unstructured data. That's also amazingly crazy, I think. So I definitely believe in the groundbreaking shift that generative AI is. I'm just saying that I think there's a big benefit from having had these experiences with automation, the more linear, structured, digital data automation we had, to working with generative AI now and finding the first places where we can sort of, get Chat GPT into our processes. Right
I
now
would say,
everyone's talking chatbot, right? Everyone's taking their processes to chatbot, but we can
yeah.
actually embed the chatbot in our processes using some of the automation frameworks. That's my point.
Yeah, no, I would say that your point is very valid, and but unfortunately, not a lot of organizations, not many organizations, from my perspective, and the conversations I'm having in the vocal group and other companies that I'm talking to, are approaching it that way. There is a need
Mm,
for speed in the market. It's very similar to what you may have seen, and I did see this many years ago with RPA. Right? It was
mm,
significantly hyped, significantly adopted. And we have today, fast forward that, we have more bots on the shelf than bananas in the kitchen, right? And both of them have the
mm,
same sort of shelf life. In some instances, I jest, but I think what's happening is that there is a rush towards uh, a very technical term that I'm going to use called GMOOT, that is often used in board and executive meetings. GMOOT, GMOOT, get me one of those, right? Uh, it's a mad rush to say, hey, they're doing something
mm,
in generative AI. I think we should do something in generative AI. When I ask the
mm,
question of, hey, what have we? Are we applying the same methodology and approach about learning about LLMs, their implications, their risks, their advantages? Are we applying the same lessons that we learned from RPA to this particular technology? And often, what you find is the answer is yes. Right? We're moving at a faster speed.
mm,
There are a lot of ideas coming in. And I think that's very positive within organizations. The need for speed is okay. How do we implement this generative AI use case, which could be very well an automation use case masked with the label of generative AI, or it could be a true AI based use case. But the lessons learned from RPA and the failures of RPA are not necessarily being applied, at least from my vantage point, to how generative AI is advancing within organizations. So, the last point I would make on that is that hence the risk profile that you would see around generative AI. So, if you were to ask an organization a question of, okay, what is the risk that your AI program could falter and go sideways and you don't achieve the business results, right? The answer to that is often silence,
mm.
because we haven't taken the lessons that we learned from RPA failures and make sure that we don't repeat those with generative AI.
I'm a little bit nervous about in general this notion, like the citizen developer notion back then. Everyone should have a bot, and then the world will fix itself. Sort of that we are now just saying here's a productivity tool, and marketing is saying it will change the world, let you fulfill your dreams, blah 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 blah. If you get this chatbot, and I think it's just broad capabilities, but it's not telling us what problem it's solving. I'm just afraid there'll be a fatigue at some point if people don't realize the benefits they were promised from just giving people a broad capability tool. Like
I agree.
Excel replaced a spreadsheet, right? A physical spreadsheet. What
Mhm.
does a chatbot replace?
I think that's a good question, but I think to your point about fatigue that occurs in the market, such is the case with technological innovation, right? And
Mm,
that's what makes a product life cycle, and that's what makes the multiple product life cycle curves. If you remember, it goes up, comes down, and goes up
yeah,
again.
yeah.
And I think it's at those fatigue points where disruption actually occurs.
Yeah, yeah, and we are trying to, as market leaders or what you call global experts, to sort of try and move us fastly ahead of the curve and see how can we quickly get to the throw of the solution and get up the slope of enlightenment, right, and know where to use it the right way. That's also why I keep asking these falsifiable questions because I want to see what actually holds true, what makes sense, what's gonna make sense, and because I'm both excited and always also slightly disappointed. Also with my own understanding. That's another thing.
I think there are some um, key elements with generative AI that we did not see with RPA. And if you give me a moment, I can expand on that. And I think those
Mm,
are the ones that are not being looked at deeply.
mm, definitely
Uh,
shared.
there are ethical concerns surrounding RPA, primarily focused on operational efficiency and fear of job displacement, which, while valid, only scratched the surface of the broader ethical implications
Yeah.
of automation technologies. Now, with the emergence of generative AI, the ethical landscape has expanded and deepened significantly. Gen AI introduces a set of um, considerations that go beyond job displacement. It's touching on issues of data privacy, algorithmic bias, the authenticity of generated content, particularly in an election cycle that we're in at the
Mm.
moment, and the potential misuse of deep fakes. Data poisoning is equally troubling,
Yeah.
involving the corruption of data pool from which AI learns and subtly destroying the AI's understanding of the world. Each of these challenges requires us to rethink our ethical frameworks and regulatory approaches, particularly if we're moving towards more of an absolute trust model, which we talked about earlier. And
Mm.
so, while RPA ethical debates were indeed important, I think Gen AI forces us to confront a, a broader, more complex set of ethical dilemmas. Gen AI can paint our dreams or can engineer our nightmares. It's our choice.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. The problems also with, as we spoke about, who had giving it rights or not giving it rights, and who, Pavlov's dog discussion we had, but
Hmm.
also I think, politically, or structurally, there's a couple of structural things, right? The copyright issue is obviously one thing, right? If we would just want to, are we just going to give up our copyright and IP to to AI builders? Because that would mean an end to capitalism. If I understand capitalism correct, it's about owning assets and investing in assets. But if you can't own IP because it's just getting eaten by an AI, that there's something there that's sort of like what, for me. and and also, but actually, another note that frightens me a little bit is, and I see a lot of proponents on this on LinkedIn and everywhere else, is that continuous improvement is a good thing.
Hmm.
But to me, continuous improvement, I have a history background, that we
Hmm.
spoke about that as well.
Yep.
um, to me, continuous improvement means that everything remains in beta, and nothing really becomes a thing or an entity. And if there's one thing civilization and humanity we're building on, that's always entities and stability, stable structures, right? The whole philosophy of Thomas Hobbes is just, we don't care who's the king. He can be an asshole, but we just need someone to tell us this is the law and stick to it so we can build
Hmm.
society. But in a continuous improvement, continuous fluctuation, there's none of that. And I'm just slightly worried sometimes, lying awake at night thinking, how's society going to look in that situation? Can humans even handle this? Are we just going to fall apart? Is civilization going to fall apart from this? That's a big worry. But it is something I'm thinking of sometimes. I am.
Yeah, well, I think as a student of history, I think you know the answer to that, right? Civilization continues, human resilience. I'm a strong believer in that. This is not the first wave we have seen of AI, right? This is probably the
No.
third or fourth, and we've seen this happen before. I think the fear in this wave is that in the past waves we have really uh, sort of, I wouldn't say the surrendered is the right word, but that comes to mind. We've sort of said that all our physical aspects of doing things will be handled by AI and robotics. And in this particular age, we're actually talking about uh, bifurcating or leasing our thought process to AI. And that causes a more significant fear of, okay, if AI is going to think for us, if ChatGPT and generative AI is going to generate things for us, what will humans do? Right.
Maybe
And
mainly, that we're gonna have it on the demand side at some point. We've always been in control of how technology shapes us because we control demand. We want what we want to buy, what we want to do, and that means that there's always this generational lag to evolution, or institution evolution. There's some things, people what they want to buy, that's what is produced to some extent. But if we make a shift around that at some point, that it sort of becomes some things that start demanding things for us because we say we trust it better to know what we need, then things can get really weird, I'm afraid.
And I think that's why, the rigorous ethical frameworks, the regulatory
Yeah.
aspects that are going in to thinking around this are important. Look, I think a lot of the tools are available to us. We went through GDPR, we went
Mm.
through Y2K. A lot of these tools are available to us. We are very poor proponents of history as human beings. On the other hand, we are very strong innovators, and love to push sort of the edge of innovative thinking, and I admire humanity for that. But at the same time, we're not very strong students of history. To give you an example, we knew the implications of social media way back when. It's only taken 20 years for us to now come back and say that, at least in the US, that under 13, you're not able to, if I remember the legislation correctly, under 13, you're not able to have access to social media. And this is
Mm.
for kids, right? But it took
Yeah.
20 years to do that. How long will it take until we see significant disasters from AI that we implement the appropriate regulations in place? And this is a hot topic being debated right now in various different parts of the world.
That's also what Doc Shannon said. We don't want to have to put up a stop sign because an accident happened. We
Mhm.
sort of want to know where to put up the stop signs before we get to the accidents, right?
Yeah.
But also, with SOMI, that's a completely different thing. I always, whenever we have a new way of communicating or faster communication, there is always some weird slight turn to despotism, right? Printing press led to autocracy or and kings, also absolute kingship in Europe, and the radio led to fascism and Nazism because now they could communicate directly with people without a filter. So I'm always, these things are there can be really big implications for it because the human mind is it's frail that way, and it's just
Yeah, but you know what's good about it, Lasse, is that a game of life is a game of chess, not checkers. So you have multiple moves versus a single sort of transient move in the game. And in that context, I think, with human resilience, with humans involved in I feel confident that we're looking at a very um, strong and innovative and bright future with AI.
mm,
But we have a window of opportunity to get it right.
yeah, yeah, or a window or a period of pain before we get it right. It's always going
There
to
you
end
go.
up right. That's the point. It's always been ending right. That's what you're getting at as well. I get that, but sometimes things just have to go wrong before we get it right. But I agree. But I just with the deep fakes and everything, and the way older generations are approaching social media, right? There's just so many people who are gonna get manipulated with this, and then that is a thing that I am afraid that the EU AI Act was just voted through the Parliament, the European Parliament today.
Hmm.
It actually says, I think that is so extensive and also a really big dig at uh, the whole internet almost, that you're not allowed to use algorithms to manipulate people based on all the obvious gender, age, blah blah, but also on social and cultural background and
Hmm.
vulnerabilities. And isn't that extensive, right? So if people know I live in an area where we eat a lot of bacon, they're not allowed to use an algorithm to push me bacon. If I'm understanding it correctly, that's the death of social. I think that's aggressively extensive, but I also think it's necessary to do this, right? Actually, I actually think it's necessary to protect us from the algorithms because they're so powerful now.
Yeah, they are, and I think that which cannot be understood cannot be regulated adequately.
No.
I mean, we have a similar situation in the U.S. as well. I think the recent presidential sort of executive order that came out around curtailing the threat of foreign data brokers that use data from Americans. Um, this particular bill is restricting the data misuse, But at the same time, it's also saying, hey, if it's for legitimate commerce of personal data, then you can use it. So, what does legitimate commerce mean, and who decides whose personal data, right?
Yes.
A lot of questions are left very open with a tremendous amount of loopholes in the regulatory practices that are being performed today.
But that's a big problem there, Shale, right? Because I think sometimes it's difficult to understand everything the technology can do, right? I think if you'd probably say the same. A lot of people will say the same. Also, leaders in the spaces would be saying the same. Even bigger leaders, also data scientists would say sometimes they don't know exactly what's going on. Um, and how can we then regulate it? We need to put up the stop sign before the accident happens, right? There is something here that looks like a bad spot, isn't there?
There, yeah. I mean, I think if you look at history, yes, it's full of bad spots and stop signs. Right, as a student of history, you're intimately aware of that. But I think you over thousands of years, human resilience has still prevailed.
Mm. Yeah, but it's not just prevailing. It's stability. That's the things that keep me awake at night. But anyway, that's a really big scale thing discussion, right? And right now we're also looking at us at a technology that can move a lot of things for for companies. And I just want to go back to something more practical and ask you. I tend to say the um, that the big market products of switchboards and orchestrators and fine tuning models is sort of an engineering answer to a strategic deficit because people don't know exactly where to implement what to use it for yet. But
Hmm.
do you agree, or do we really need these things right now? I think the switchboards, for instance, is funny because if you move your prompts from one model to another, it will react differently. So just having
Yeah.
switchboards to switch model doesn't make any sense at all. But they built those. A lot of the big GSIs have built switchboards, which I think is a funny thing, right?
I think there's a market for it. Look, one way to look at this, let's say, is that you look at RPA itself. It rose to prominence because disparate systems would not talk to each other,
Mm.
and in particularly in legacy systems. Was that a strategic deficit that led to RPA's rise and the latest sort of modest flatline or fall? Yeah, I would say yes. You fast forward that to how RPA grew up, a bot for everyone, citizen development for all, and soon we have a lot more bots sitting on the shelf. But uh, look, the need for orchestrators, switchboards arises when you have more bulbs in a house in different rooms that you need to control. To use an analogy, right?
Oh, but I completely agree. But that's why you have it installed in the house as well. The my point is, RPA b- was born out of just simple automation back in the '90s, or maybe even earlier than that. But the orchestrators made it into RPA to some extent that you could control all of these different automation techniques. But you didn't build the orchestrators at first, right? You waited and saw what use cases were there, and then you started
Hmm.
orchestrating the use case. You're not orchestrating the code; you're orchestrating the use case, right? The
Right.
use of it. And that's why I think, building orchestrators and switchboards and all these kind of technologies right now, or half a year ago almost, some of them, seems a little bit like building parking lots when you don't know what a car looks like.
Building parking lots where you don't know what a car looks like. That's a very interesting analogy, by the way.
Yeah.
I think, look, to be honest, we've not seen orchestrators take off. Microsoft doesn't have one. To give you an
No.
example, right? The orchestration, the orchestrators that exist with the incumbent RPA players are old and to some extent archaic. And we've seen, orchestration companies come through. There are pockets of success. If you look at this market, it's a handful of companies in this space that claim to be, sort of the orchestrator for multiple automation tools, for multiple RPA tools, and all of them combined in the market, based on my calculation, are doing less than $10 million in revenue 3 years
Mm.
into this market. So your parking lot analogy might be a good way to explain that.
Yeah, but you still have, big GSIs coming out and building that for LLMs. A year ago, they started announcing a lot of those, and they've been announcing it over the last year. and and it just seems like this it's obviously just also to make them feel to be relevant in the market, right? But
Hmm.
it seems like an over exaggeration, right? Like we don't we don't even know the end game, right? We don't know the mid game enough to buy these big
Yeah.
models or build these big things, right? That's where I also see,
Mm.
the most of the fine tuned models I've seen, if you talk fine tuning of LLMs, have been a little bit underwhelming in what they actually perform for the millions they've been spent on it, compared to
Mm.
what you can do just with simple RAG or prompt engineering. It, I'm not really impressed by these $1 million projects coming out of technical projects, right? Because I think what the market has right now is primarily a strategic deficit of finding the right use cases to implement.
I agree with you on the use case part. I think I'm a little cautious about the fact that it's not complete doom and gloom in the market either. Right? There are pockets of success
Oh
that
no.
you do see within organizations. I think you're starting to see use cases emerge around digitizing standard operating procedures or providing better customer experience. Uh, but to your point, sustainable, predictable, repeatable revenue growth using these tools and the case studies around that are very thin.
Mm. I also think that's because, to some extent, there's been a big focus on this as a chatbot, so let's use it as a chatbot. And I
Yeah.
think the imagination around how you can work with unstructured data has taken a long time to sort of set in, right? There's people understanding that. I think that's part of the answer. Basically, people have tried to use it for chatbots for anything, and then they found it to be underwhelming in some things, or hallucinating, or jailbreak or something like that. And now they need to look at it in a different way, finding out they have to
Yeah.
control a little bit more. And that prompt engineering is basically, I've said that also, chaotic code. It's chaotic
Right.
coding. It's still coding. You still have
Yeah.
to be very precise, but it's just chaotic coding for a
Yeah.
chaotic engine, a lying machine, as Kurt Cagle called it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the maturity. People getting a little disillusioned, and then starting to realize, where can we actually use it for something real.
Yeah. I just want to clarify one thing. I think your points that you just made and my comment about the sustainable, predictable, repeatable revenue use cases being thin uh, are related to generative AI, not
Yeah.
AI in general, right? In AI in general, there are some very strong and good use cases. So I just want to clarify for the audience that would, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what you were describing, your comments were related to generative AI.
Oh, sure, Shail, and I know why you're saying it as well. Obviously, establishing Pluto Shift AI, which is going to do something different than just Gen AI. So I completely understand what you're saying, and you're
I
absolutely
wasn't
right.
thinking about that, but thank you for pointing it out.
Yeah, no, but you also, I have it actually in my PowerPoint, because I just trolled a lot of the big analyst firms, and took some of their quotes, and one of
Yeah.
them said that Gen AI is going to increase global GDP by 7%. And you're like, where did they get these numbers from? Right, generative AI going to raise it 7%. But when and how and why? But no one really answers that question. That's the problem, right? It's just, is it by Copilot? Really? I know Microsoft said you could be a better you and fulfill your dreams in their marketing with it, but I'm still like, but where? I still sleep badly at night, and I have Copilot. No, okay, that's no, that's that's a joke. But 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 Shale, bigger or smaller? No, AI models. What are we going to be using in a year? Is it going to be smaller and faster, or is it going to be bigger and broader? Right? Right. What do you think the trend is?
I think the AI model size over the next couple of years hinges on balancing efficiency with computational power and specific application needs. On the one hand, the trend towards larger models has been driven by their ability to understand and generate human-like text and images and now video as
Mm,
well. However, there's a growing emphasis on making AI more accessible and environmentally sustainable. That's a big conversation in this market at the moment. One that favors the development and use of smaller and
mm,
more efficient models, optimized for very specific domain specific tasks. And these smaller models can be deployed, broadly, including on your laptop or mine on edge devices, making the tools widely available. So ultimately, I think we're going to see a bifurcation in the model development strategies. The larger models for foundational research and applications requiring, deep contextual understanding. Think pharma as an example,
Mm.
and smaller specialized models for everyday applications and devices.
Yeah, so we've been yeah, that's the point. I've mentioned that I think in a chat I had with someone the other day that we've had these the trend a couple of years ago was more on how can we get more specific, more industry specific, a little bit away from the standard software, right? But a little
Mhm.
bit more specific, industry cloud and stuff like that. Those discussions, and then suddenly everything became general and generic again. Here's a foundational model that will solve a blah blah blah. Just use that one, away with that.
Mhm.
But the turn back to specificity is super interesting. And that also leads me to something I really should ask you actually. Is I said in one of the earlier podcasts that there seems to be a gulf between or a chasm between the foundational models and how easy they are to access. Just you go into any hyperscaler and you just start using one on a consumption rate, right? And then it costs you almost nothing to use it and building your own specific trained machine learning AI models and structuring the data and all those things, right? The chasm is really big between those two um, two areas of AI, those two AIs, right? To some extent. And I want to ask you maybe a difficult question, and okay if you have to think about it. But now you work in Pluto Shift AI. How do you think these two things are going to get closer to each other? Is are the LLMs going to be more and more specific, required to be more and more specific, and then thus more expensive to build for something that makes sense, or are the tailored AI models going to be easier to build? And what, how? I think we need to find a way that this AI market meets each other. Does my question even make sense?
I think, look, I think one cannot underestimate the domain expertise that is required to infer the information that is going into these models and coming out of these models. So I would say more that, customized AI models that are tailored to the needs of that specific domain are going to be critically important. We're starting to see that within organizations. It's coming from a different angle, though. So, for example, if you take banks, majority of them want to build their own private LLMs inside of their organization, right? And hence, by virtue of that, it becomes more customizable to that specific entity. You
And
mentioned Pluto
extremely
Shift,
expensive. Yeah.
and extremely expensive for sure. You look at industrial plants as an example. A water plant might need something totally different than what an energy plant might be looking for, right? The variables and the parameters might be similar, but the outcomes of those would be very different. So I do believe that smaller models, very domain specific, environmentally sustainable, efficient from a cost perspective, have a significant prominence in the market.
Mm. But my question is really built around. I think actually it was on before I had my episode with him was Kurt Cagle writing something in December saying that okay, everyone's talking about AI, but some of the people he knew who were experts on AI had never had more trouble getting jobs
Mm.
because they worked with machine learning and graph technology and all those things, right, for building proprietary tailored AI models, but everyone was just looking solely on foundational models for 20 in all of 2023. So what I'm actually looking for is how are we going to, getting that is that going to pick up again? That I think it is, but there's just so many expectations. This is going to be easy to work with, but it's going to be expensive to work with, and and maybe it's the term that's the problem. Do we need a new term?
I think by the time we finish the podcast, let's say probably three new terms would have been invented already. No, I don't think we need a new term.
A new abbreviation.
Yeah, you can call it that if you like.
No, but I mean, instead of calling it all AI, then it seems like we're not talking about anything sometimes, right? It seems like we're talking about something that no one really defines because it's either or, right? You see the chasm between these two approaches, right?
No, I do, and I don't think there's a clear answer
No,
yet on that.
no, no. But that's why I wanted to pick your brain on it. But I think, Shail, this has been a really great conversation, and I'd love to
Likewise.
have you back at some point to discuss what you've been, what's happened maybe in a year or something that could be fun, seeing what's going on and Pluto shift. What are you seeing in the market? How has the world changed? Because I think it's going to change a lot, and your insights are really brilliant and very broad, and you have a great background in the automation space and everywhere as well. So I really love speaking to you. Um, but
Likewise.
um, but let's go on to the final question, the one I always ask, because I've been really looking forward to hearing your answer to it. So, Shale, what is the only constant?
Lasse, you've described in this conversation a couple of times about your concerns around where AI is going, and you mentioned you don't sleep sleep well at night with those concerns. Look, for me, the only constant, and maybe this will help you sleep better at night, but the only constant is silicon needs carbon. The only constant is the intrinsic need for silicon to be guided, shaped, infused with purpose by carbon. And I think you've captured by now that by silicon I mean AI, and of course, we are all carbon forms. This metaphor underscores, the fundamental truth that while our technology advancements are pivotal in reshaping the world, they ultimately serve the needs and aspirations and the values of human society, and in this case, carbon. So, technology, no matter how advanced, requires a human touch, human creativity, human ethical consideration, a human vision to realize its full potential. So this constant reminds us that the future of innovation is not just about developing more sophisticated technologies, but in my humble opinion, it's about enhancing human collaboration, understanding, and empathy. And it's a call to ensure that, as we advance technologically, we we remain anchored in our humanity, and that we leverage our creation to foster, a better world for all. And in doing so, remember, silicon needs carbon.
We are the pivot around all of the pivoting. That's a great answer, Shale.
Thank you.
I love that, and thank you very much for being on the only constant. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Thanks for having me.
You've listened to The Only Constant, a podcast sponsored by Basico.